The scent of lilies and old varnish was suffocating, a sweet, cloying perfume that clung to the back of Carter's throat. It was the smell of piety and grief, but for her, it was the smell of judgment. Seated in the front pew of the small, stone church, she felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes, not in sympathy, but in cold, clinical assessment. The dark fabric of her simple, unadorned dress felt like a costume, a poor attempt to blend into a world she had fled nearly 2 decades ago. Her back was ramrod straight, a posture drilled into her by years of discipline, yet it felt less like strength and more like a fragile defense against the whispers slithering through the solemn air. The organ played a somber dirge, each note a heavy footfall on the grave of her childhood. This wasn't just her mother's funeral, it was a tribunal, and she was the one on trial. Her family, a tight-knit constellation of aunts, uncles, and cousins, filled the rows behind her, their collective disapproval a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. They saw her as the prodigal child who never returned, the great disappointment, the one who had broken her mother's heart by choosing a path they couldn't comprehend or control. They whispered about her life, a narrative they had written themselves, full of failure and shame. And as her Aunt Clara, her mother's older sister and self-appointed matriarch, rose from her seat and approached the pulpit to deliver the eulogy, Carter knew the verdict was about to be read aloud for all to hear. She braced herself, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. The real battle wasn't fought on dusty foreign soil under a scorching sun. It was here, in the suffocating silence of a hometown church, against the ghosts of expectation. Aunt Clara adjusted the microphone with a theatrical sigh, her black dress rustling like dry leaves. She was a woman carved from disapproval, her features sharp and her gaze sharper. She scanned the assembled mourners, her eyes briefly flicking over Carter with an expression that was a masterclass in pity and condemnation. "We are here," she began, her voice quivering with practiced sorrow, "to remember my dear sister, Eleanor, a woman of grace, of community, a pillar of this town." She gave everything she had to her family, to her children. Her eyes found Carter again, and this time they lingered. She dreamed of seeing her children build lives here, surrounded by love, by tradition. She was blessed to see her son, David, do just that. She gestured towards Carter's cousin, who sat preening in the second row, his chest puffed out in his well-tailored suit. David was the golden boy, the successful local businessman who had done everything right in their eyes. He had married a suitable girl, produced 2 grandchildren, and never strayed more than 20 miles from his birthplace. He gave Clara a small, sad smile, a perfect performance of the grieving, dutiful nephew. "Eleanor was so proud," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength, "of the family that stayed, the family that understood what truly matters, roots, loyalty." Each word was a carefully aimed dart. Carter felt them land, small pricks against the armor she had spent a lifetime forging. She kept her gaze fixed on the polished wood of the coffin at the front of the church, a desperate attempt to focus on the real reason she was here, her mother. She tried to summon a memory of her mother's smile, the real one, not the strained, weary version that had graced their last few phone calls. But the image was hazy, obscured by the fog of distance and unspoken words. The eulogy meandered through a curated history of her mother's life, one that conveniently edited out any mention of Carter's ambitions or her mother's quiet support in the early days. In Clara's telling, Carter's departure was a tragic event, a wound from which her mother never truly recovered. The narrative was simple and damning. David was the success, Carter the failure. The congregation nodded along, their faces masks of solemn agreement. They were a Greek chorus affirming the family's gospel. Carter could feel the smug satisfaction radiating from David's pew. He had always resented her, even as a child. He resented her intelligence, her unwillingness to conform, her quiet intensity. Her leaving had been his greatest victory, solidifying his position as the undisputed heir to the family's approval. Now, he was soaking in the validation, his victory lap taking place over their shared matriarch's casket. Clara's voice dropped to a conspiratorial hush, drawing everyone in for the final, devastating blow. "A mother's love is unconditional," she whispered, dabbing a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "But her heart can still break. Eleanor loved all her family, of course, but every mother worries over the child who loses their way. And it was her deepest sorrow, a burden she carried with quiet dignity, that her own daughter became her." Biggest failure. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. A collective, sorrowful murmur rippled through the church. It wasn't a gasp of shock, it was a sigh of confirmation. This was the truth they had all agreed upon for years, and now it was canonized, spoken from the pulpit itself. Several guests turned to look at Carter, their expressions a sickening blend of pity and morbid curiosity. Her cousin David's lips curled into a faint, triumphant smirk. He had won. The family's narrative was now public record. Carter felt a hot flush of shame and rage creep up her neck, but she forced it down, locking it away in the iron box where she kept all the other emotions that were too dangerous to feel. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She focused on her breathing, a measured, rhythmic cadence she had perfected in situations far more perilous than this. In, out, control. The profound silence that followed Clara's pronouncement was broken by the soft creak of the church's heavy oak doors. A few heads turned, annoyed by the interruption. Carter didn't bother to look. She was locked in her own private world of grief and fury. But then the whispers started again, different this time. They were no longer aimed at her, but at the figure now standing at the back of the church. The whispers were laced with confusion, then recognition, then awe. A man was walking down the central aisle, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the stone floor. He was older, with a mane of silver hair and a face that was instantly recognizable from newspapers and evening news broadcasts. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, but it was his aura of quiet authority that commanded the room. Senator Thompson. He wasn't just a state senator. He was a respected national figure, a man known for his integrity and his long service on the Armed Services Committee. His presence in their small town, in their humble church, was inexplicable. Clara faltered at the pulpit, her mouth slightly agape. David's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. The senator did not acknowledge the stunned crowd. His eyes, clear and focused, were fixed on one person, Carter. He walked steadily forward, not to the pulpit, not to the grieving family, but directly to the front pew where she sat alone. The entire church held its breath. He stopped beside her, and the scent of lilies was momentarily replaced by the clean, crisp scent of his wool suit. For a moment, he simply stood there, a silent sentinel. Then he turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the gawking faces of her family and the other mourners. His expression was unreadable, but there was a subtle hardness in his eyes. He then turned back to Carter. He didn't speak. Instead, he extended a hand. It was a simple gesture, but in the charged atmosphere of the church, it was a profound statement. It was an offering of solidarity, of respect. Carter hesitated for a fraction of a second. Years of training had taught her to be wary, to analyze every situation, every variable. But looking at the senator's steady, compassionate eyes, she saw no agenda, only a quiet understanding. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of her pain and her strength. Then he stood even taller, and his voice, calm and clear, filled the silent church. It was not a politician's booming speech, but the measured tone of a man accustomed to being heard. "I did not know Alina well," he began, his voice resonating with a quiet power that made Clara's eulogy seem like petty gossip. "But I know her daughter." He paused, letting the words sink in. He was still holding Carter's hand. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over Aunt Clara, who was frozen at the pulpit, and David, whose face had gone pale. "I know her not as the person you have described," the senator continued, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, "but as a leader, a person of immense courage, discipline, and honor." Another pause. The silence in the church was now absolute, thick with tension and dawning confusion. No one dared to breathe. The senator looked directly at Carter, his expression softening with profound respect. "The nation owes a debt of gratitude to leaders like her. Her service honors her mother, her family, and this country." He then looked out at the sea of bewildered faces, his gaze finally landing on Aunt Clara, who looked as if she had been struck. He raised their joined hands slightly, a gesture that was both a support for Carter and a rebuke to her accusers. And then he delivered the final, world-altering blow. "Major General Carter," he said, his voice ringing with pride and authority, "your service honors us all." The two words echoed in the cavernous silence of the church. Major General, not a failure, not a runaway, not a disappointment, a Major General. The title was a thunderclap that shattered the carefully constructed reality of everyone in the room. Carter watched as her cousin's face went through a rapid series of transformations. First, confusion, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Then, disbelief, his mind refusing to process the information. Finally, a slow, sickening dawning of comprehension, as the smug certainty he had worn his entire life crumbled into dust. His jaw went slack, and the color drained from his face, leaving him looking sallow and small in his expensive suit. Aunt Clara, still standing at the pulpit, looked as though she had turned to stone. The lace handkerchief she had used for her crocodile tears slipped from her numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The carefully crafted image of herself as the wise, discerning matriarch had been obliterated in a single sentence. She was exposed not as a guardian of family values, but as a petty, ignorant tyrant. The rest of the congregation was a sea of slack-jawed astonishment. People craned their necks, whispering furiously to one another. The story they had all known and repeated for 2 decades was a lie. The black sheep, the family disgrace, was a decorated, high-ranking military officer, a 2-star general. It was a truth so far outside their realm of understanding that it felt like a fiction. They looked from the distinguished senator, a man of unquestionable credibility, to Carter, who had not moved a muscle. She remained seated, her back straight, her hand still held by the senator, her expression a mask of quiet dignity. Her silence was more powerful than any speech she could have given. It was the silence of someone who had never needed their approval, who had been living a life of such consequence that their small-town dramas were utterly insignificant. The organist, flustered, seemed to think music was the answer and began to play a hesitant hymn. It was a feeble attempt to restore normalcy to a moment that was anything but. The senator gently released Carter's hand and took a step back, giving her space. He had said what needed to be said. His purpose was not to humiliate, but to correct the record with the irrefutable weight of the truth. He had given Carter back her name, her honor, in the very place where it had been so viciously stripped from her. The rest of the service was a blur. The pastor, a young man who looked completely overwhelmed, rushed through the final prayers. No one was listening. The funeral for Alina had been completely overshadowed by the resurrection of her daughter's reputation. As the service concluded, and the pallbearers, including a shell-shocked David, began to move the coffin, the mourners did not file out in an orderly fashion. They remained in their pews, staring, whispering. They were looking at Carter with new eyes, a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, shameful realization of their own complicity in the family's narrative. Carter finally rose to her feet, her movements fluid and controlled. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play in which she was the main character. The rage and shame from earlier had receded, replaced by a profound, weary calm. The truth was out. It changed nothing about the years of estrangement, the missed phone calls, the chasm that had grown between her and her mother. But it changed everything about this moment. She turned to Senator Thompson. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He simply nodded, his eyes conveying a deep well of understanding. "It was the least I could do, General. Your mother wrote to me once a few years back. She sent a small donation to a veterans fund I support. She included a note, said she was proud of her daughter serving our country. She didn't say how exactly, but she was proud." The words were a soft blow to Carter's heart, more impactful than any insult. Her mother had known, or at least she had been proud. That small, private admission, revealed now, was a bittersweet gift. It was a secret her mother had kept, perhaps to protect Carter from the family's jealousy, or perhaps because she didn't know how to bridge the gap herself. It was a painful, beautiful mystery she would never solve. The post-funeral reception was held in the church's drafty basement, a space that smelled of stale coffee and decades of potluck dinners. Carter had considered skipping it, simply getting in her rental car and driving away, leaving the wreckage of her family's assumptions behind. But that would have been a retreat, and Carter did not retreat. She walked into the room with Senator Thompson a few steps behind her, a silent, powerful endorsement. The chatter in the room, which had been a frantic buzz of speculation, died instantly. It was as if a switch had been flipped. Her relatives, who had so easily ignored her or offered flimsy, pitying condolences just an hour before, now stared at her as if she were a stranger. They parted before. Ray her like the Red Sea, creating a wide, awkward path to the lukewarm buffet table. Her Aunt Clara was huddled in a corner with her sons, their faces a mixture of anger and humiliation. Clara refused to look at Carter, her jaw set in a line of stubborn denial. To acknowledge Carter's rank would be to acknowledge her own colossal, public failure of judgment. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened. It was David who finally broke the spell. He approached her, his usual swagger completely gone. He looked smaller, diminished. He held a paper plate with a single, sad-looking sandwich on it. "Carter," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't meet her eyes. I had no idea." The apology was weak, pathetic, but it was all he had. Carter looked at her cousin, the golden boy, the one who had everything handed to him, who had built his identity on being the successful one. She saw not a villain, but a man whose entire world had just been upended. For the first time, she felt a sliver of something akin to pity for him. "I know you didn't, David," she said, her voice neutral, offering neither forgiveness nor condemnation. That was the most damning response of all. His opinion, his knowledge, his approval, none of it had ever mattered to her mission or her life. Her success was not a rebuttal to him. It was simply a fact, as indifferent to his existence as the tide is to a single grain of sand. The realization seemed to hit him hard. He just stood there, speechless, as she walked past him to get a cup of coffee. The rest of the reception was a series of surreal encounters. Uncles who had once patted her on the head and advised her to find a husband now approached her with a stammering, newfound respect, asking vague, clumsy questions about her work. Aunts who had whispered about her wasted life now complimented her dress and asked if she would be staying in town long. Each interaction was a small, quiet victory, but it brought Carter no joy. It was a hollow vindication. Their respect wasn't for her, the person. It was for the title, for the rank, for the proximity to power that the senator's presence represented. They hadn't changed. The circumstances had. They were fawning over a uniform they couldn't see, a symbol of a world they couldn't possibly understand. She saw the truth clearly now. Her family's love, or what passed for it, was entirely conditional. It was based on a narrow, suffocating set of expectations. Stay close, marry well, reflect their values back at them. She had broken those rules and they had written her off. Now, presented with a different, more impressive set of credentials, they were scrambling to rewrite the story again with them in a flattering light. It was all about them. It had always been all about them. Senator Thompson found her by the window, looking out at the gray, overcast sky. "Are you all right, General?" he asked softly. Carter took a slow sip of her coffee. It was bitter. "I will be, sir," she replied. "It's just a lot to process." He nodded, understanding. "Battlefields come in many forms," he said. "Sometimes the quietest ones are the most brutal." He was right. She had faced down enemy fire, made life-or-death decisions affecting hundreds of soldiers, and navigated the treacherous politics of the Pentagon. But nothing had prepared her for the uniquely personal cruelty of her own family. It was a different kind of warfare, one fought with whispers and expectations, where the wounds were invisible but ran deep. She felt a profound sense of loss, not for the family she saw before her, but for the family she had always wished she had, one that would have loved and supported her regardless of her career path or the number of stars on her shoulder. As the reception began to wind down, Carter knew she had one last thing to do. She made her way to the corner where Aunt Clara was still holding court, though her audience had dwindled and her voice lacked its earlier conviction. Carter stopped a few feet away, waiting patiently. Eventually, one of the cousins noticed her and fell silent, nudging Clara. The matriarch finally turned, her face a mask of rigid pride. Her eyes were cold, defiant. "Carter," she said, her voice clipped. It was a dismissal, not a greeting. "Aunt Clara," Carter responded, her tone even. "I want you to know that I never once spoke ill of this family to my mother. In every letter, in every call, I told her I was fine and I asked about all of you." Clara's expression flickered, a hint of surprise or perhaps guilt. "My life is not a judgment on yours," Carter continued, her voice softening slightly. "It's just my life. I'm sorry that it caused my mother pain. That was never my intention. But I am not sorry for the path I chose." She had not come for an apology. She knew she would never get one, not a real one. She had come to state her truth, calmly and without anger. She was closing this chapter on her own terms. For a long moment, Clara said "Nothing." She stared at her niece, this woman who was a stranger to her, a decorated general who had been sitting in her church all along, hidden in plain sight. Carter could see the war behind her eyes, the ingrained beliefs of a lifetime battling against an undeniable, inconvenient truth. But pride was a fortress not easily breached. Clara simply gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. It was the closest she would ever come to a concession. It was enough. Carter turned and walked away, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She had faced her accuser, spoken her piece, and was now free. Her duty here was done. She found Senator Thompson by the door waiting for her. "Ready to leave?" he asked. "More than ready," she said. As they walked out of the church basement and into the fresh, clean air, she didn't look back. There was nothing left for her there. The past was a country to which she would not be returning. The drive away from the town was quiet. Senator Thompson seemed to understand her need for silence as she watched the familiar, yet alien landscape roll by. The fields, the houses, the old water tower, they were pieces of a life that no longer belonged to her. It was like looking at a photograph of someone else's childhood. "Major General Carter is quite a title," the senator finally said, his voice gentle. "It takes a long time to earn that." Carter smiled faintly, her eyes still on the road. "It does, sir. A very long time, and a lot of miles away from here." She thought about the journey, the grueling days at the academy, the deployments to places whose names her family couldn't pronounce, the sacrifices, the losses, the immense, crushing responsibility. She had built her life brick by brick, far from the critical gaze of her relatives. Her identity was not forged in their approval, but in the harsh, unforgiving crucible of leadership and service. And that was why their judgment, while it had stung, could not ultimately break her. Her foundation was too strong, built on something far more real and substantial than their petty expectations. "Your mother would have been incredibly proud," he said. "I think, in her own way, she was," Carter replied, the thought bringing a fresh wave of both sadness and peace. She just didn't know how to say it. In her world, a daughter's success was measured by the man she married and the children she raised. A daughter becoming a general, there was no vocabulary for that here. They drove on, leaving the town and its narrow definitions behind. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the highway, Carter felt a sense of closure. Justice had been served, not through a dramatic confrontation or a satisfying revenge, but through the simple, unassailable power of the truth. Her family had been forced to look at her, really look at her, and see not the failure they had imagined, but the leader she had become. Their world had been shaken, their certainties shattered. What they did with that new reality was up to them. It was no longer her concern. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it. It buzzed again. With a sigh, she pulled it out. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize, but she knew who it was: David. The message was long and rambling. It was an apology of sorts. He wrote about the pressure he had always felt, about how he had been taught to see her ambition as a threat to their way of life. He said he was ashamed. He said he didn't know what to say to his own children now. He asked if they could talk sometime. Carter read the message and then deleted it without replying. Perhaps one day she would be ready to have that conversation, but not today. Today was for her mother. Today was for quiet reflection. The wounds were too deep for a simple text message to heal. Forgiveness was a complex terrain, and she was not ready to navigate it. Her family's reckoning was their own journey to take. She had her own path to follow, and it led forward, not back. She had spent the day as Carter, the daughter, the niece, the cousin. But as she drove toward the airport, back to her life, she felt the familiar weight and comfort of her true identity settling back onto her shoulders. She was Major General Carter. She had a command to lead, soldiers who depended on her, and a mission to fulfill. She had honored her mother by living a life of purpose. And in the end, that was the only judgment that mattered. The car pulled up to the departure's curb and she turned to the senator. "Thank you again, sir, for everything." "The honor was all mine, General," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "Go give M hell." Carter smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached her eyes. "Yes, sir." She stepped out of the car, pulled her small, functional suitcase from the trunk, and walked into the bright lights of the airport, her back straight, her stride confident, leaving the shadows of her past behind her for good.